I'm pleased to introduce to you my friend Clark Colahan, a professor of Spanish literature at Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington. Professor Colahan studied at Pomona College and CSU and received his doctoral degree in Spanish, Latin American, and French literatures from the University of New Mexico. I just learned last night that after completing his doctoral examinations on those literatures, Professor Colahan decided that he would pick up Hebrew so that he on his own, so that he could write his dissertation on the medieval Castilian rabbi Shem Tov. Professor Colahan's research focuses these days mainly on Renaissance Spanish literature. He has published an edition of Cervantes' Persiles and Sigismunda, his last novel, and he has also worked extensively on the Quixote and has a current project underway. Whitman College is supporting his current leave to work on Juan Maldonado, a 16th century author whom Colahan suspects may have written the Lazarillo de Tormes. In 1994, the University of Arizona Press published Colahan's witty and insightful study of Sor María de Jesús de Agreda called The Visions of Sor María de Agreda, Writing, Knowledge, and Power. This is the book on Sor María. We are privileged today to participate in his presentation on this rare nun, the mystical María de Agreda, feminist Christianity, and the Spanish state. Professor Colahan.
You're very kind, Valerie. I'm certainly enjoying being here at BYU the last couple of days. This is certainly a wonderful time of year with the fall colors on the Wasatch Front. I lived for many years in Albuquerque, where I did my graduate work, and then I worked in the university there. So it's fun to be back here in the Rockies in the autumn. I also feel there's a kind of a link between the part of the country where I live and BYU. I spent a lot of time also at Washington State University, and of course they're the Cougars. Plus, the mascot or the teams at Whitman College, where I teach, are the Fighting Missionaries. So I feel I'm sort of in tune with that here. It's also particularly pleasant to be here talking about the topic today. I think this might be the right place to really get into this woman's work. It's a remarkable combination of traditional Christianity with what Catholics call private revelation. And together, I think they have produced possibly the most imaginative move on behalf of women's power, even though there were quite a few during the heyday of Spanish patriarchy that was pulled off, because it was pulled off both in politics, as we'll see, and in a very, very popular work of literature. Now, the first thing we need to talk about is what you're thinking right now, which is María de, who was that? And I have never heard of her. And maybe it really should be Agreda, right? How do we pronounce that? Well, most Americans know her as Mary of Agreda. But no, that's not right. Professor Hegstrom, as always, got it right. And it is María de Agreda, which is the name of the town in north-central Spain that she was born in and that she really never left. It was 1602, and during then a large part of the 17th century, she became famous throughout not only Spain, but throughout most of Europe by her accomplishments in several areas. She was, first of all, you will find this somewhat contradictory, a fearless overseas missionary. She was a close advisor to the King of Spain, Philip IV. She was the mystical author of the longest, most detailed, banned by the Pope and by the University of Paris, yet still popular in many countries, biography of the Virgin Mary. And it's based on interviews with the protagonist. She was by far the favorite figure out of Spain's rich religious past for the dictator of Spain, Francisco Franco, who ruled the country for 39 years in the middle of the 20th century. And today, the chances of the Vatican making her a Catholic saint are improving. The so-called decree of silence on her case is about to be lifted in Rome, is what I have heard. In addition, an American writer, Marilyn Fedela, has just completed a 500-page historical novel based on her life and including a great deal of thoroughly researched information. So, probably the first question I should try to answer for you is why almost none of you has ever heard of her. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we all live, culturally at least, closer to London and to Boston than we realize. I'm going to read you a little excerpt here from the New Catholic Encyclopedia, which is a fairly recent reference work produced in the U.S. and Great Britain for the enlightenment and guidance of the faithful. If you take it off the library shelf, and I'm sure you probably have it here in the library, you look under the heading of Private Revelation. This is just part of what you will find. Quote, when reading books of revelations or reports on visions and apparitions, the wise rule is not to draw on them for spiritual guidance, unless it be something the Church has approved and teaches independently of them. What is singular and not in keeping with the common teaching of spiritual and theological writers must inspire caution and distrust, as also what tends to satisfy unnecessary curiosity. For example, information about details of the Passion or about future events, such as is found in the writings of Mary of Agreda or Anna Catherine Emmerich. One should beware of over-eagerness for extraordinary facts. A craving for the marvelous and the sensational is not in keeping with the mind of the Church. It exposes one to the danger of not heeding her decisions in these matters, although she has the right and the duty to judge of their nature and truth. End quote. All right, first, in this rather forceful statement, there's a skeptical attitude toward divine revelation of new truths since biblical times that I think has an unmistakable flavor of what would be called perhaps mainline Protestantism. Since the time of Sor Maria's death, and Sor, by the way, is a Spanish word that means sister, and it's referred to nuns. Since the time of Sor Maria's death, science, of course, has assumed in our culture many of the roles religion used to play, and her brand of science, and she thought of it as science, is one in her day that was called infused science, which means divinely revealed, and not, obviously, the experimental kind. Second, the two women mentioned by the encyclopedia's unreliable writers, Anna Catherine Emmerich and let's call her María de Agreda, are guilty of the same thing. And they both wrote biographies of who? Right, the Virgin Mary. As we shall see in Sor Maria's book, the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception was an opening to insert ideas that were unpalatable to many churchmen. Ideas such as God has to be understood not only as Father, Son, and Spirit, but also as Mother, Daughter, Wife, and Ruler of the universe. The mother of Jesus, who emerges in the 2,000 pages of her book, did everything her son did. She did miracles, preaching, missionary work. She suffered to redeem the sins of the world. Plus, she wrote the Creed, and in general, she directed the work of the early church between naps, during which her soul was supervising activities in heaven. Whenever the apostles needed a Solomonic decision that would affect all of Christendom, they would wake her up. And as far as her husband and her father, that is, God the Father, he personally gave her an intensive seminar on everything, so that after 6 days she knew as much as he did. He felt this was important because he also made her an official member of the Trinity, and she needed infinite knowledge to wield wisely her infinite power. In short, Sor Maria's view of things is unscientific, unpatristic, and that may well explain why you never heard about her. Now, the situation in Spain is different. As Professor Hegstrom just mentioned, Thursday night we'll be showing an hour-long documentary on her life and work that was aired across Spain about 5 years ago by Spanish National Television. If you go see it, you'll get a good idea of what the Spanish equivalent of PBS viewers think of her today, and it's really very similar to what I'm going to tell you here. But in that country, she has another, a more pop culture dimension. It goes back to the older, more medieval Catholicism that was still alive as the official, non-optional religion of 20th century fascist Spain. Her profile in that tradition is that of the spectacular miracle worker. I'm going to show you some pages, which we have some slides up here. This is from a long 1991 story that appeared in the Spanish magazine Más Allá, which means the beyond. And I had a long telephone conversation, actually several, with the editor of this magazine. And you can believe me when I tell you that this is a 100% New Age pop publication. So let's take a look at the cover of this magazine. It says the first article is called Dying and Coming Back to Life Whenever You Want to. The epic of the Thanatonauts, I guess that's the word they made up, people who travel through death. History of a Reincarnation. Then it says Trances, Visions, and Bilocations of María Jesus de Agreda. Then the Mystery of the Island of Pohnpei. The New Paradigms, This is How the World Will Be, etc., etc. The last one is Collectibles from Movies, Heaven, the Bible, and Mythology. So it's into anything that seems somewhat occult and somewhat strange. And obviously she gets included in there because that's her tradition. So you've been missing out on this as an Anglo-American. But even as a 20th century American, you wouldn't necessarily have been deprived of news of her had you been a Catholic of Irish or German descent. I'm going to show you now some more pages from an entire issue that was dedicated to María de Agreda in 1958 in a Midwestern Catholic magazine called The Age of Mary. Oh, where did that go here? Okay, let's, before we go to this 1958 version, let's take a look at a few more pictures from the 1990s version from Spain here. This is a photo. I don't know if you can see it in this light. This is actually a statue representing her in her casket. And her body is considered miraculous because it hasn't decomposed, and they didn't do anything to embalm it. Turns out that runs in the family. They also have her mother there. When I visited, they had the mother standing up against the wall. She's sort of naturally mummified. But that's considered a sign of her holiness. So that's actually, I think, a statue, and she's actually down below there. Let's go on to the next one. Here she is, and as I mentioned, she wrote The Life of the Virgin Mary by talking with the Virgin. So here she is on the left, and she's writing, and the Virgin is explaining while I guess she's holding the baby Jesus in her lap. I got this holy card, as they call it, from the nuns at her convent in Agreda in central Spain. The young man in the yellow shirt is Javier Sierra. He's the editor of Más Allá, The Beyond. And here he's talking with a Basque priest who happens to be an expert also on María de Agreda. And you'll hear an interview with him if you come see the movie tomorrow night. And they're discussing her miracles. If you walk around the little town of Agreda in as I say, northern Castile, you'll see references to her all over the place. They like to make pictures out of tiles, as you probably know, in Spain and Mexico. So that same picture that was the basis for the last slide, here we see her also writing her Life of the Virgin in tiles. This is her family coat of arms. Nobody knows what it means, probably because they made it up. It turns out that her father was of Jewish descent, what we call conversos in Spain, but that was pretty much a social stigma of major proportions. So they probably made up this coat of arms and tried to pass themselves off as old aristocracy in Spain. That's the house that she grew up in, and then later was turned into a convent. Her bedroom became her cell. All right, now, 1958. There was a remarkably all-male bunch of Catholics, there they are, who thought that all the information on the life of the Virgin found in Sor Maria's book was a treasure. And they thought it was exactly what the country needed to model and reform its way of life. So let's take a look at some of these pictures. These are priests and professors in Indiana, primarily. All right. All right, so here's Sister Mary Amatora from St. Francis College in Fort Wayne, Indiana. The Mystical City of God is the name of Sor Maria's biography of the Virgin. And obviously it's big. You can see the 4 volumes. And she, as you can see, she thinks it's a masterpiece and it's especially useful for our times. Let's go on to the next. I don't know if you can read that. The Catholic Reformation in Education lies within the 4 volumes of the Mystical City of God. So they were convinced that if this book was mandatory reading in all Catholic universities, this country could be turned around and straightened out, because everybody could imitate the lifestyle of the Virgin Mary, now that we know what it is. Let's see. Then he explains why the biography of Our Lady is entitled The City of God. Basically, the idea is that, first of all, God lived in the Virgin when she was pregnant with Jesus, and also because she is the link between the divine and the human in Catholic theology. So therefore, to reach the Father, we have to go through her to connect the human to the divine. And then the moral crucifixion of the Mystical City of God. So this writer is protesting that this book is not better known and doesn't get more attention. Okay, Agreda and the Popes, from Agredistas to anti-Agredistas. She became so well known in the years following her death and so controversial that the Sorbonne, the French National University, held a major conference about her and her book. And then they voted whether she was divinely inspired or whether she was crazy. And by a vote of about 2/3 to 1/3, they voted she was crazy. But that didn't go down well in Spain. So especially the Franciscans, also the Jesuits in general, the Spanish religious orders defended her and the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. So Europe was split into people who were in favor of her ideas and people who were opposed to her. And the Pope decided to put the book on the prohibited list outside of Spain for a while. But if you were in Spain, it was all right to read it. Okay. All right, and this finally is from about, 1990. And this is an opera, as you can see, a dance and an opera. Michel Larsen was the choreographer. Joseph Weber was the musical composer. At that time, he was teaching music at the College of Santa Fe, New Mexico. And she is a big legend there, as I mentioned. And he heard about the legend, I think actually through one of my papers, believe it or not. And then he went on and read all about her and wrote some beautiful music. And you'll see a little section of this in the movie tomorrow night. And Michel Larsen did a wonderful job of modern choreography. It's sort of the motion of Sor Maria's soul. And she's in tights and all the kind of emotional gymnastics she's going through, adjusting to her life as a nun. All right, I think that's as far as we need to go there. Now, let me give you some details on her role as advisor to the Spanish state. She was, in fact, for about 22 years, really the major confidant, one of the major advisors, perhaps the major advisor for Philip IV in the middle of the 17th century. So how did this unlikely situation develop? By the time she was 40, she was famous for her writing of spiritual meditations and for miracles. And of all of the latter, the most truly spectacular was her missionary work that I mentioned earlier. It involved taking the gospel to Indians in the New World when she was in her late teens. And tomorrow I'll be talking at length about this in the literature class here at BYU called Brilliant Women. So for now, let it be sufficient to say that she had become, by this age, a celebrity, and the king wanted to meet her, so he went to her convent. In 1643, the king had to ban from court the Count Duke of Olivares, who, as royal favorite and principal advisor for 20 years, had virtually ruled the country. At this time, Philip and Spain found themselves succumbing to major problems. There were wars on 2 or 3 fronts, against France, also on home territory, against rebellions by the Portuguese and the Catalans. For a few decades, Portugal had been part of Spain, and of course, in the 17th century, it did regain its independence. Inflation, poverty, homelessness, a severe decline in agriculture and business, all of these had been with the country for over a century, resulting from several factors during the lifetimes not only of Philip IV, but of his father, Philip III, his grandfather, Philip II, his great-grandfather, the Emperor Charles V, and 2 generations farther back, Ferdinand and Isabel, who of course united the peninsula. These problems included expulsion from the country of the highly productive Jewish and Muslim segments of the national population, unbelievably short-sighted and institutionalized discrimination against the descendants of Jews, like Sor Maria's family, the smothering of new ideas through the growth of the Inquisition, a widespread aping of the aristocratic scorn for working for a living, the importation of shiploads of gold and silver producing inflation, and probably worst of all, the financing of incessant imperial and religious wars all over Europe through loans from foreign bankers. It didn't help that the ingrown Habsburg dynasty had been steadily going downhill. Charles V personally led his armies into battle, making conquests even in Africa. His son, Philip II, however, spent all his time doing paperwork in the office, which was located in his personal monastery called El Escorial. He created a bureaucracy that literally invented red tape. They used red tape for the papers, in the belief that governmental delay was desirable because it gave people the chance to work out their own problems. His son, Philip III, was known as the Hunting King because to that sport he dedicated most of his energies. Philip IV, Sor Maria's Philip, somewhat similarly had the reputation of being the party king, and he spent a lot of time begetting illegitimate children. It was in these circumstances that the desperate king had decided to reinstate in his dynasty the discontinued custom of the monarch personally leading the troops into war. He was on his way toward a scene of battle in Catalunya. He turned off to Agreda to meet Sor Maria, since she couldn't leave her cloister. This was on June 10th, 1643. He took immediate liking to her, and he ordered her to start writing him letters. And they corresponded back and forth for 22 years until they both died in the same year, 1665. And they wrote to each other frequently. 614 letters have survived. All right, let's take a look at what he was like. Is that the first one? There he is. All right. This is when he's 18, and I think he has a rather sensual look to him, that he's not too serious. All right, let's see what else we've got here. All right. This is a little hard to see. This is how they would entertain themselves at court. This is hunting at court. To make sure the deer didn't get away, they put up extremely long pieces of cloth with posts. And they put the deer at one end and then chased them down to the other. So it was hard to miss. All right. Here he is later on in a painting by Velázquez. And once again, you can see all the grandeur. But at the same time, it's rather an affected quality with his lace collar there and his rather sporty mustache. All right. Now let's see. This is his favorite, the Count Duke of Olivares, who was promoted to the military order of Santiago. That's why he has a cross on his chest. He's got that big key showing he basically has the key to the country. And he did all of the work for Philip IV for the first half of the reign until finally his enemies forced him out. And then that's when Philip had to look for help elsewhere. All right, this woman is Isabel de Bourbon, who was the wife, the first wife of Philip IV. And this is about 1634 to 1635. But she died. Let's go on to the next one. This is a very famous, or a detail from a very famous picture called Las Meninas, the Ladies in Waiting, by Velázquez. So this is one of the daughters. This is the Princess Margarita María in about 1656 at court. This is his male heir, Baltasar Carlos, and he'll turn out to be quite important. Baltasar Carlos dies as a teenager, and this becomes quite important for the story of María de Agreda. Okay. Now here he is, Baltasar Carlos, shortly before his death as a teenager. All right, this woman is, let's see, make sure I got this right here. This is María of Austria. She was the Empress of Austria. Now, Philip IV is a Habsburg, and you know that the Habsburgs were originally from Austria, and they got ahead by intermarrying. And all the intermarrying with their relatives, as we'll see, led to decline of their mental faculties. And this is the sister of Philip IV. Now let's go on. This is her daughter, which makes her the niece of Philip IV, but Philip marries her as his next wife. And here she is, and I think the next 2 or 3 images are quite interesting. Let's go back to the previous one here. So here she is before she gets married. So here she is. She's very stylishly dressed. Looks very cute. Now we go on. Now she's married, and you can see her life has changed. And so here she is. She's praying. She's got her prayer book. Her hairdo and her dress have changed substantially. And now, after he dies, this is what happens to her. So it shows to what extent many women's lives revolved around men. And, you know, we hear this term phallocentric, but, I mean, those 3 images just seem to bring out to me how her whole life depended on him. All right. Why did Philip and Maria then write all these letters to each other? In part, he had lost the advisor, as I said, who ran his government, made his decisions. But in part, he was weak, he was fearful, she was strong, and she was comforting. Also in part, though, holy women, women who worked miracles, had commanded in Spain, especially since the time of Teresa of Avila, surprising respect. Such women's self-discipline, associated with a lifestyle based on what was called heroic penance, was believed to grant them direct access to God. The divine power ruling the earth from heaven would listen to them and do what they asked. The widespread faith in their ability to influence divine providence exceeded ours in Alan Greenspan's ability to save the economy. What are the letters about? Okay, at the top of the list probably are the king's expressions of insecurity and his imploring her for help. After their meeting, he writes to her, quote, "I left Madrid feeling helpless, lacking all human resources, trusting only in divine ones. I can rely very little on myself, since I have greatly offended God and continue offending him. So I turn to you so that you will keep your word to me to cry out to God on my behalf." In 1649, he writes similarly to her, "I charge you to put pressure on the Lord, since we find ourselves absolutely lacking in everything for our defense." So that was how much power she was thought to have. In response, she spends a lot of time encouraging him. For example, quote, "We must hope that this little ship of Spain will never be wrecked, no matter how much the water comes up to our necks." But more significantly, she gave him concrete advice. Advice pretty much anyone today would agree with. This is why an early 20th century Spanish historian called her the brains of Philip's administration. Now that, in the first place, is a left-handed compliment. But it's also an exaggeration, but she was unquestionably a force for good in his rule. Their letters, in fact, often deal with the nation's political and military problems. In this regard, Sor Maria insisted often to the king that he do everything possible to bring about peace, especially in the years near the end of the 30 Years' War. Quote, "For the sake of peace, losing is winning." Or another quote, "Since the only way we can defend ourselves now is through miracles. Peace is so necessary for all the poor souls who are perishing." Her tone in all these matters is always serious, full of moral purpose. For example, she says, quote, "Your Majesty should command your advisors to take pity on your poor, helpless, suffering vassals, instructing them not to levy new taxes, or to squeeze blood and sweat out of their faces by taking away all means of support." Her culminating accomplishment in this regard was being named by the king as his agent in negotiating with France the Peace of the Pyrenees after many years of war. She accepted the assignment and successfully carried it out. the monarchs of both France and Spain met on the border in the middle of a river, and where they did reach an agreement that lasted quite a few years. And we have an interesting picture of this. This is what the Spanish book calls a fantasy version of this meeting. It was done actually in the Low Countries. But you can see this is the river flowing between France on the left and Spain on the right. And they have put together some boats that can go out on a track, so to speak, out into the middle of the river. And the two kings can meet there, and they have their armies massed, I guess, on both sides. But in this way, they felt secure, and actually it was pulled off. I think we have another image about this. You can't see this very well. This is a commemorative medallion celebrating the Peace of the Pyrenees. Let's see what else we've got here. All right, what is this? Well, don't know what happened to the rest here. All right, well, we'll call it good there. All right, one final subject she often wrote to Philip about was the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception that I've mentioned before. And that doctrine holds that the Virgin Mary alone of all mortals was created without sin. And she was created even before the rest of the world was created. As I've commented, it holds a certain relevance for feminism in that the feminine is thereby introduced into the Godhead. She persuaded the king to have his ambassador in Rome work for years on behalf of bringing about an official Vatican proclamation of that doctrine as church dogma. That did not happen during her lifetime, but it did eventually in the 19th century. Another idea that's fundamental to her biography of the Virgin is one that within the next few years, I hear, is also going to be made official Catholic doctrine, that the Virgin is the co-redeemer of the world on an equal footing with Jesus. So her ideas were clearly ahead of the Catholic Church of her time, and clearly she knew how to use politics to advance them. She had another legacy that turned up much less happily for Spain centuries later. Another Spaniard whose ideas were instead clearly behind his time knew how to use, or I would say misuse, a little bit of her religion to advance his political agenda. General Francisco Franco imposed a back-to-basics ideology of church and state fusion. It was accompanied by the leader's personal enthusiasm, as I said, for this nun, and the case for her canonization, which for 2 centuries had been languishing in the Vatican's dead files, received fresh stimulus, once again, as it had under Philip IV. He endeavored to get the attention of the Vatican and to try to convince them that she was important enough to become a saint, but I think partly because of Franco's reputation, they didn't get anywhere. 2 scholarly editions of the nun's voluminous correspondence with the king came out during the Franco years. With effusive conviction and considerable inaccuracy, she was called, as I said, the brains of his administration. And for Franco, the implied subtext was clearly the symbiotic relationship of monarchy and Catholicism. Today, among the country's college students, the classic sort of Spanish women's mysticism Sor Maria exemplifies, that is, cloistered and spectacularly miraculous, is now sarcastically rejected by most, and it is seen as part and parcel of Franquismo's blackly humorous project of returning the nation to a superstitious and unscientific past. Just as progressive 19th century novelists ridiculed and rejected taking seriously miracle-working nuns, monjas milagreras, so too among young people I talked to in Spain in the 1990s and even today, Catholics whose devotion is traditionally Spanish, like Sor Maria, are known as Ave Marias or Mother Superiors. Yet, above this post-Franco backwash of anti-mystical sentiment, there have emerged 2 more open-minded versions of Sor Maria and the kind of religion that she represents. One is the novelist, Gonzalo Torrente Ballester, who was a historian and teacher by profession, but quite a celebrated novelist by avocation. And in 1977, he brought out a novel called Fragmentos de Apocalipsis, Fragments of Apocalypse. The vision, and then we have another vision, which is the one you're going to see if you go to the movie, directed by María Teresa Álvarez, who worked for Spanish National Television as the coordinator, director, and hostess of Mujeres en la Historia, Women in History, which was a series, weekly series of 60-minute documentaries that Spanish National Television did for 2 or 3 years in the middle of the 90s. And the one on Sor María was aired August 22nd, 1995. Now, Torrente Ballester knew the story of María de Agreda very well because he was one of the 2 editors of her correspondence with Philip IV. The first reference to her in the novel is quite clear, although it's really rather misleading about what he's going to eventually say about her. A nun called Mother Transfiguration of Mount Tabor, known to her friends as Transfi, experiences and recounts visions of hell. In these, strangely, she encounters still living Spaniards whose views and behavior are unacceptable to the politically conservative branch of the church. Similarly, in some of her letters to the king that I didn't mention earlier, Sor María describes mystical trips that she made to the afterlife and conversations there with the dead son, with Baltasar Carlos. The boy reports to her, and she reports back to the king on who's arriving in hell, including courtesans who suffer punishment by wearing immodest dresses that are literally flaming. The official Franquista view of church-state cooperation is here obviously turned upside down because the author stresses the repressive political use that's made of Mother Transfiguration's accounts by a man called Father Casto Almanzora, who's a fairly transparent symbol for Franco. Now, his name Casto means chaste, and it suggests the dictator's holier-than-thou assertion of moral purity for himself and for his fascist regime, while Almanzor was a fanatical medieval North African ruler whose armies, just like Franco's in the Civil War, came out of Africa and swept north over the peninsula, bringing havoc and imposing intolerance. The identification is reinforced by passages detailing the priest's ongoing project to turn the church into a business corporation that sells eternal life in the form of stock to wealthy capitalists. This is an easily recognizable feature of life under Franco in light of the strong support he received from the rich in alliance with the conservative majority within the church. I could go on and give you more details about what happens in this novel. I want to leave a little time for questions. Let me just summarize and say that you think that the novel is quite opposed to mysticism, to women mystics, but it turns out, in a really surprising turnaround, that mystical journeys are held out as the hope for the salvation of Spain at this crucial junction in its history. You have to remember, when Franco dies in 75, he's been in power 39 years, and everybody is terrified they're going to have another civil war. The one that was ended in 36 cost 1 million lives and produced long-lasting hatred and bitterness among the 2 Spains, the liberals and the conservatives. So everyone was afraid this would happen again. So the novel is called Fragments of Apocalypse because they feared an apocalypse that would happen at this time. And what is the solution? Well, it turns out that this novel has a lot of time travel in it. And at first it's time travel backwards. And what we see is that in order to do time travel, you have to sleep on the steps of the high altar in the cathedral in this city. And if you do that, then magic powers happen, and you're able to travel in time. And there's several examples. A couple of them are very, very reminiscent of the mystical journeys made by María de Agreda. Her trip as a missionary, where she was miraculously carried to the New World. Another trip where angels took her up to visit all the Ptolemaic heavens, as they were understood at that time. 2 journeys just like that take place in the novel. In addition, there's a journey in time back to the French Revolution. And there's a zealot who says we have to stop conservative reaction from preventing any change in Spain. And so he wants to go back and make sure the French Revolution doesn't get bogged down. There's sort of a parallel, I think, with the situation in Spain. He goes back to the time of the French Revolution, and he goes back to try to kill the man who assassinated Danton, who was the leader of the Terror, because he feels the French Revolution should have been more thoroughgoing. It should have killed more aristocrats. So his goal is to get rid of the assassin of this terrorist, or of this extremist. But what happens is he goes with his girlfriend. He gets there too late and is executed. But she, because she didn't do it out of hatred or planning to kill anybody, but out of love for him, she is hailed as the woman of the future. She somehow turns up wearing trousers and is instructing women on how to be women of the future following the French Revolution. So I think that's a very interesting parallel between what do we need to bring hope for the future. Is it going to be violence? Is it going to be attacking the other side before they get you? Or instead, is it going to be reaching out in love and trying to help other people? And I think that's clearly the message that you get. And so if you think of mysticism as faith, vision, and imagination, which is what it turns out to be in the novel, then you can see that Torrente Ballester is saying we don't need a church that's a stooge for repressive government. What we need is the Christian spirit. We need faith and love and imagination to find our way in a journey into the future. So that is, I think, the message of the novel, and ultimately Torrente Ballester, although he seems to reject, Sor Maria does not. I think he ultimately affirms her message. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Professor Colahan has generously agreed to take questions, and so if you'd like to just direct them to him, we have 5 minutes more. Yes.
How well was she known in the Americas? How much was she read or talked about?
She was extremely well known in New Mexico. Perhaps a little in Mexico, but primarily in New Mexico. Outside of that, I don't think she was terribly well known. I got onto all this partly because I discovered an old ballad, an alabado. It's an old New Mexican hymn that was collected in the 40s near Taos, New Mexico, and nobody had realized it's basically about her. And it mentions the mystical city of God in the song and all of this, but everybody had forgotten who she was. So she is quite a legend. The Indians in the 20s and the 30s looked to her to come back and save them from hard times during the Depression. There are a lot of people who remember her in New Mexico, surprisingly, and there's a lot about that in the documentary that we'll show tomorrow night. Oh, there is. Oh, interestingly enough, when I was in Mexico City last year, there was an exhibition of paintings. Barbara, do you remember the name of the painter? He was my wife, Barbara. Villapando. Thank you. Yeah, and he did a big painting of the mystical city of God. It's a huge canvas, and it's based on her book, and it shows an actual city that's all allegorical. So she was known in New Mexico as well. Oh, Fray Junipero Serra, who founded the missions in California, a big fan. Her book was used as a training manual for missionaries at the main missionary training center for the Franciscans north of Mexico City. And why was that? Well, because they should imitate the Virgin. As I said, she was a missionary, so shouldn't the Franciscan missionaries try to imitate her way of doing it? So he knew her book inside and out. And when he got to California, he was so excited, he hung up a huge bell and rang it and hoped some Indians would show up. And he said, I feel just like Maria. The Agreda is wonderful. So she was fairly influential. Well, I think there's some comparison. They're both very bright women. Sor Juana mentions her as someone who inspired her. She's included in a list of 80 distinguished women who were inspirations for her. But I think that Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz is much more intellectual, not nearly so much a mystic. Maria de Agreda was extremely bright. This biography of the Virgin is all organized into numbered paragraphs. It has summaries. It is almost a scholarly kind of production, but ultimately at the root of it is this infused knowledge. It's simply God infuses images and ideas into your head. And you don't get that nearly as much in Sor Juana Inés. And of course, Sor Juana Inés was eventually silenced for competing as an intellectual. Women could get away with this more because they weren't claiming we're doctors, we're learned, we're competing here with the doctors of the church. No, we're special. We get this special information that men don't get. And they often said men don't get this because they don't suffer as much as women. Women get it because they've suffered more. Yeah.
I didn't understand the missionary. You had mentioned that she had a kind of a mystical journey to this.
Right. I'm going to be talking about this in class tomorrow. And so I don't want to give away all the secrets quite yet here. But things will be revealed. We will have revelations. But basically, it was a miraculous, mystical journey hundreds of times to the New World to preach. Other questions? Well, all right. My pleasure.